Okay, that's the end of our three speeches. We now have an opportunity to take some questions from the floor. I think we have some.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And my talk follows Alyssa's quite well. I'm going to talk about three things: rising inequality and gender inequality. I'm going to look at the austerity policies, their rationale and gendered impact, and then think about alternative understandings of the economy for a more inclusive, gender equitable society. In this respect, I'm also looking at gender in two ways. One is the outcome of particular policies, but also thinking about incorporating a gendered understanding of the economy would also lead to different outcomes for men, women, everybody. Well, we're all here, I guess, to hear Thomas Piketty this afternoon. I think what's curious is the way in which inequality has become an issue, not just for the political left, where it's always been, but has become much more widely seen as a source of concern. The Pope, for example, referred to it as the root of all social evil in a tweet not so long ago. And Barack Obama has referred to it as the defining challenge of our time. As we all know, Thomas' book is the bestseller. So there's this huge interest in inequality overall. But then what about gender questions? Because gender inequality has been there forever, and it's enduring, it's universal, and yet somehow it doesn't seem to attract the same kind of concern. Having said that, it has become a focus for institutional policies, including the World Bank and the European Union. But their kind of approach to resolving gender inequality is very much one of integrating people within a market society, better integration for women within a market society, rather than recognizing how a market society reproduces inequality. And the OECD and Thomas Piketty's work has been incorporated along with Tony Atkinson's in much of their thinking. They argue that redistribution can only ever be a temporary measure, that the only way to stop inequality is to stop the underlying widening of wages. And I just think it's a lovely way that they say, oh yeah, we have to stop this. Without necessarily thinking, well, they do think about how it might be done, but when you look at the various different theories of wage determination, which the OECD reviewed very nicely in one of their 2012 publications, they don't really account satisfactorily either for gender inequality or for inequality by social class. And this has led various, one Nobel Prize winner in economics to talk about social norms. And clearly, as a more social scientist interested in economics, the idea of an economist resorting to social norms is quite an interesting idea. But then, of course, the question is, social norms are also gendered. And Thomas Piketty in his book talks about the ways in which it's been elite managers who've been able to appropriate higher returns. But either way, what's important is to have more work on the process of wage determination, to have a better understanding of how inequality is reproduced. And one very sort of, so the point is that if social norms influence the determination of wage inequality, are those social norms ones we would choose to have if we thought about it? And there's an interesting contrast one can draw between care workers and finance workers. And both, I would say, are cases of market misrecognition and undervaluation in one case and overvaluation in the other. Just to give you a very specific example, in the context of the bank problems in the UK, we had a financial executive from a failed bank retained to advise on its restructuring on a monthly salary that was 3 times the annual salary of a childcare worker with 20 years of experience. Now, I don't think one would if that was put to the vote, I don't think it would be something that people would choose. So the kind of earnings that people have can be just as easily a result of market imperfections as proof of social value. And that comment comes from Adair Turner, who was head of the UK's Financial Services Authority. So my point here then is that much more needs to be done on the processes driving inequality in order to get a better sense of how they come about. mean, the high profits and the ways in which capital is share of value is increasing also has to be thought about in terms of how that capital is itself produced. And one way in which it is produced is by the huge difference that has emerged between the returns to labour and the returns to capital, and that in itself requires some kind of understanding of wage determination. So turning now to the second part of what I wanted to say, thinking about what's happened in the crisis and the consequences of austerity policies. Our Prime Minister, David Cameron, claims we're all in this together, but in actual fact, the effects of the spending cuts as a consequence of the recession have fallen very unevenly. It has been the lower income classes that have experienced the biggest proportional decline in their incomes. The cuts have affected particular family types, particularly lone parents and single pensioners. In both cases, women dominate those groups. The gender wage gap has started to increase following a sort of decline in recent years, and some of the decline that has happened in recent years is due to a widening of class inequality. And the ways in which the budget has operated are not ones in any way to redress the situation. In the context of the recession, assuming the objective is to cut the debt and deficit, two choices really: cut public expenditure or raise taxation. The UK government has had an 80-20 in terms of reducing expenditure and increasing taxes. In the latest budget, it has increased to 90-10%. And then when one analyses the gendered impact of those cuts, one finds that women have experienced about 80% of the cuts compared to men. And this is through the specific, quite detailed policy measures that the Women's Budget Group in the UK analysed. Reducing the duty on beer, for example, would in fact have paid for some of the cuts in one of the childcare programmes that, if you hadn't done that, you could have paid for something else instead that would have been of greater value and required fewer cuts in public expenditure. So there is a gender differentiation in terms of outcomes of budgetary policies. And although the government do have a gender impact analysis, it's done very, very poorly. For example, in relation to classic cars, they thought that would have no discernible gender impact. I don't know too many. Maybe I'm making extraordinarily gender stereotypical assumptions, but I don't think none of my friends own classic cars, put it that way. And so you've got this focus on austerity to secure deficit and debt reduction. Now, first of all, that presumes that reduction is necessary, and it presumes that it can be secured through austerity. But the evidence isn't very convincing. The government has succeeded in reducing the deficit, as these figures are as index figures taken back to 2007, reducing the deficit a little bit, but not the debt. And this raises a whole question about the amount of room a government has to manoeuvre and what it can do with that kind of the fiscal possibilities that it actually has. And it's quite interesting to contrast definitions. I mean, the IMF argue that it's room in a government's budget that allows it to provide resources for a desired purpose without jeopardizing the sustainability of its financial position or the state of the economy. Now, its financial position is very much influenced by a high interest, low inflation policy. Now, that policy is a particular class policy that benefits rentiers and owners of credit. And it's to the and so it's a particular policy. It's not a technical necessity. It's a political choice. And there's no real evidence for any particular level of government debt or deficit. There's always an alternative in economic terms, but different strategies imply that there are different distributions of costs and benefits. So by contrast, for example, you've got choices between how much and how these various different things are raised. And the UNDP, they have a different definition, sort of incorporating the idea that it is something which a government can use for the purposes that it decides to have, not something which is technically determined by various nominal economic indicators. And one of our students defined it differently again, taking the idea that one would incorporate a specific set of objectives taking into account the interests of marginal groups, so paying attention to inequality. But the point is that it could be done in different ways, and the government has chosen to do it in one particular way. So what kind of alternatives can we think about in this incredibly unequal society? And again, I think it's interesting that people not necessarily associated with the left are talking about things like inclusive capitalism. But a lot of this often depends on ex post redistribution rather than challenging the structure of the economy in the first instance. And that's why I turn to the feminist F plan for recovery that's been outlined by the Women's Budget Group in the UK, drawing on Diane Perrons' work, which first of all sees the economy differently, and rather, as Elisa was arguing about, the need to recognise the economy not just in terms of formal production, but in terms of reproduction. And in that regard, then, one can think in the context of the budget and austerity policies, the need to think about investment in social infrastructure rather than just physical infrastructure, recognising the productive contributions of reproductive work. And this is an argument that the Women's Budget Group have made over the years, and the diagram that I have there from Diane Perrons comes from the late 90s. But what's interesting is that people like Özlem, Elisa, and Rania Antonopoulos, working on the United States and South Korea, what they've shown is that there are the multiplier implications of expenditure in this sphere add more to the economy than, say, does physical investment, investment in infrastructure. Now, this isn't a battle between women and men, but to argue that both are necessary for recovery. So by way of conclusion, I would argue that two things are absolutely necessary to think about inequality. First of all, you have to think about the ex-ante processes driving inequality and to think about wage determination. And that needs to be addressed very seriously. And then secondly, to have the ex-post progressive taxation. I don't think one will work without the other. And both are a little bit utopian. But I think when the knowledge about the huge gaps in wage inequality is highlighted, perhaps there'll be some kind of change. And valuing social care work differently, I think, is a big step in that direction. So what I'm looking for is some form of Keynesianism, but in a global context and in a gendered context, in order to bring about a much more inclusive and sustainable society. Thank you.
Thank you very much.